So not too long ago, a member of the U.S. House of Representatives made the following statement. I believe, quote, that probably statistics would show that the Western European races have made the best citizens of America. They are, he continued, more easily made into Americans. Sounds like this comment could have been made last week. These words, however, were uttered by Dr. John Travers Wood, a Republican congressional representative from Idaho in 1952, to lend his voice to those in favor of amending U.S. immigration policy by lowering quotas for non-white migrants coming into the United States. His argument should ring familiar to most anyone paying attention to immigration policy in the Trump era. The Trump administration's ban on all Muslims coming from select countries, its separation of families along the U.S.-Mexico border, or the president's reference to black immigrants coming from, quote, shithole countries, have all served as touchstones of today's U.S. immigration regime, which appears to many as unprecedented in its harshness. Wood's remarks, however, made more than 3 generations ago, remind us that the Trump administration is by no means the first in the U.S. to propose racially based exclusionary citizenship policies regarding non-white immigrants. Nor is it a novel thing to use, as Trump staffers often do, so-called scientific proof, in this case statistics, to argue that Western European races can more easily transform into Americans and, by extension, citizens. Whether we're discussing the global politics in the 1950s or the contemporary moment, historical perspective helps us distinguish between the seemingly new and unprecedented on one hand and the old, recurrent, and repackaged on the other. Wood's comments serve to remind us that race, nationality, and religion have been part of the selective criteria for citizenship and membership in the political community of the United States ever since the nation's founding, while also being fundamental to the development of citizenship regimes in all the major democratic polities in the contemporary world. But such pronouncements by Trump, Wood, and others offer much more, actually hints and glimpses of underlying assumptions, ideas, and concepts that have been around for quite some time. As I've detailed in my new book, The Specter of Race, How Discrimination Haunts Western Democracy, the Democratic and Republican forms of Western governance, from their inception, have had restrictive immigration policies based on a number of different factors: nationality, religion, ethnicity, gender, and what we now refer to as race. And I've compared and contrasted these seemingly political paradoxes in classical Athens, France, Britain, the United States, and in many other nation-states in the Americas. The most robust, long-standing democratic polities in the contemporary world have been housed in societies that have profited from slave labor, empire, and colonialism. Those who were treated as objects of slave labor and subjects under colonial rule were more often than not granted limited political and social rights when they existed at all. So part of this book's mission and the brief talk today is represent democracy not as a concept and as an ideal, but as a practice, a particular combination of norms, institutions, and actors. One of the key questions this book explores is how the practice of democracy can, and has in certain instances, generated political inequality. The unequal relationships within a democratic society can reveal much about democracy's contours and the limits of its horizons. In fact, exclusionary barriers to political membership in democracies goes back to classical Athens, the place often identified as the birthplace of democracy. When examined across distinct times and places, we find a conjuncture of exclusion and democracy in a variety of different locales. The problem of exclusion and ultimately political inequality in democracy is thus no mere aberration or anomaly, but in fact a constitutive element of democracies and their Athenian-inspired successors. For this talk, I will focus on 2 key assumptions coursing through contemporary discourses, particularly nationalist and right-wing discourses in Europe and the United States. First, the idea that nation-states have been and somehow require homogeneous populations in order to function effectively as democratic polities. According to this view, what is now referred to as diversity in national societies is detrimental to political stability. The second assumption, often articulated, on the other hand, by well-meaning liberals and even some leftists, is that the practice of democracy is anathema to xenophobia, ethno-racial and religious chauvinism. From the Athenian democratic polity to modern and contemporary versions of democracy in contemporary nation-states, democracies have always maintained a sharp distinction between members of their societies, those who simply live in the society, and members of their polities, right? The people who hold formal political membership, that is to say, who are members of the political community. As democratic institutions maintain barriers to civic membership, they must always justify that exclusion. Moments of geopolitical crisis, whether we're talking about the Greeks during the Greco-Persian Wars, the era of the Red Scare in the United States, or the contemporary debates in Germany and the EU more broadly over migration, reveal popular and governmental anxieties about being overrun by certain, not all, foreigners. Citizenship becomes associated with particular types of people and not the actual exercise of rights, duties, and responsibilities. So let's start then with classical Athens. There, citizenship was not based on some transcendental criteria, but selective application and omission of law, and myth in response to changing political circumstances. Athens fought off several invasions by outsiders, most notably the Persian army, and instituted criteria designed to restrict and limit citizenship to true Athenians, literally citizens of the soil. Pericles' citizenship law of 451 required dual Athenian parentage for citizen status. Additionally, descent-based citizenship was also underpinned by an origin narrative which proclaimed that the early king of Greece, Erycthonios, actually descended from the earth. Subsequently, citizenship criteria became based upon the premise that the first citizens of Athens literally sprang from the earth, and their successors were descended from those citizens who emerged from the soil. So this made what, I'm going to introduce a concept here with an ungainly or clumsy pronunciation, autochthony, unique in classical Athens, was that the definition of citizenship was based, in fact, in mythology, not fact. The belief that Athenian citizens after the Persian War were the offspring of people who literally sprang from the soil, right? Now, this political mythology served to naturalize citizenship, making it inaccessible to those who could not prove they descended from Athenian soil. Additionally, since citizenship was patrilineal, a woman, even one who descended from autochthonous parents, could not become a citizen, nor could slaves or foreigners. In this sense, autochthonous criteria for political membership also served as a form of immigration policy, excluding the majority of non-Athenians from citizenship. As noted by Demetria Cassimus, a scholar of this period, quote, Athens granted citizenship status only to those who could persuasively claim an uninterrupted and uncorrupted blood tie to their native founder. Laws governing marriage, citizenship, and inheritance concretized the ideology's emphasis on descent on the basis of blood. They disenfranchised medics and their offspring. Only the children of free-born natives were eligible for democratic citizenship. Now, there's another explanation for this that I'd be happy to get into for the Q&A as to why, what were the sort of internal motivations for creating such a law. In addition, classical Athens relied heavily upon slave labor for citizen subsistence and wealth. Territorial expansion and subjugation of non-Athenian populations, what we would now refer to as colonization, along with the threat of invasion, also influenced how democracy and, most importantly, differential citizenship regimes developed. This revised citizenship regime that limited citizenship to Athenians of the soil, the literal ferment, and excluded slaves, women, and foreigners from formal participation in the polity, effectively gave Athenian citizenship a gendered and ethno-national character. It does, however, the exclusion of these people from citizenship does not negate the uniqueness of the Athenian democratic experiment. What it does do, however, is complicate our reception of democracy's relation to political and economic equality. Rather than view democracy as the precondition of equality, could it be that social and political inequality is the prerequisite of democracy? Right, now, this is counterintuitive to a claim I'm making in some sense. In modern politics, that is, with the rise of the nation-state system, religious, ethno-national, presumably racial and gender distinctions became instruments to distinguish members of the polity from the massive bodies in the society. What a political scientist called at the dawn of the 20th century indices of difference, population variation and differentiation became institutionalized by apparatuses of state in religion and economy and informed the practice of democracy. Thus, common to the city-states of the classical era and the nation-states of the modern world is a popular and formal emphasis on population origin to distinguish potential citizen from partial or non-citizen, and to distribute suffrage and other forms of citizenship rights based on the aforementioned distinction. As key variables in the development of citizenship regimes, policies of education and socialization, the race concept, as I'd mentioned before, became the modern equivalent of autochthony in many Western and Western-influenced nation-states. And the ensuing hierarchies premised upon them became the basis for what I've characterized as racial regimes. Racial regimes provided the means to institutionalize and rationalize hierarchies premised upon perceived somatic and phenotypic distinctions, which themselves were based upon faulty ideas of biological or geographic origins, which ultimately had no scientific basis. Formal and informal institutions, laws and edicts provided the scaffolding for the normalization and routinization of such hierarchies, moving them from the realm of the idiosyncratic, discretionary decision to structures of marginalization and oppression. Okay. Now, this quote, it's interesting to linger on for a while. He's an important figure for the purposes of the book because I can actually trace an intellectual genealogy, as we'll see in the subsequent plate. And this was one of the founders of the Department of History at Oxford. He had many visiting professorships in the latter part of the 20th century. And he delivered a series of lectures in the 1870s, which grew to be very, very influential and influenced the development of several political science and history departments in the United States. So either direct students of his or in a pedagogical sense, descendants of students of his actually taught his work and his presumptions well into the 1940s, right? So let's go back. Right. So he says here, right, other communities from the beginning of political society have either been avowedly or practically founded on the distinctions of race. So what he's suggesting in this passage and in sort of the remainder of this article is that what makes the United States unique is not the experiment in democracy. That had already been tried before. What made it unique was the idea that different groups of people could inhabit the same democratic space. And this he saw as the principal challenge. Now, I was not able to find direct correspondence between the two of these people, but Woodrow Wilson did take the meeting minutes and the seminar notes for a very, very important seminar on historical and political science at Johns Hopkins University. And it's important to remember, I don't quote me on this, but it's something like Hopkins in the sort of turn of the 20th century produced something like 20 to 30% of all PhDs in the country, right? And in a very important book known as The State, which was Wilson's best known scholarly work, He cites Freeman. And so this quote, in many ways, bears traces, what you could call philosophical sediment of these ideas, right? Homogeneity of race and community of thought and purpose among the people, right? This is the first requisite for a nation that would be democratic. These words, articulated in Wilson's book, The State on the Eve of World War I, are also echoed in the language of the Third Reich, Adolf Hitler. There is one error which cannot be remedied once men have made it, namely, the failure to recognize the importance of conserving the blood and the race free from intermixture, and thereby the racial aspect and character which are God's gift and God's handiwork. It is not for men to discuss the question of why Providence created different races, but rather to recognize the fact that it punishes those who disregard its work of creation, right? So how do we make the sense of the fact that we find traces of these ideas in three very, very different people? And certainly by World War I and the dictated peace imposed upon Nazi Germany, one would think that in some sense ideological differences would map onto the distinctions between Allied and Axis powers. Right? More contemporarily, we have Marine Le Pen, the daughter of Jean Le Pen, seated to her left, founder of the party Front National, the National Front. And we have this quote. On one side, we have the importing of foreign cultures by a wave of foreigners who, unlike those who came before, wish to impose a change in our behavior and our lives. On the other side, there are the European commissioners who force their crazy administration on every aspect of our daily lives. Now, this quote has fairly coded language with sort of subtle indicators. First, it's a crack or knock on the EU, and a sort of articulation of the need for French sovereignty and the need for France to have its own, in effect, immigration policy, the possibility that France could be overrun by foreigners, particularly in this case in the contemporary moment, Muslims and other people. Right? We have this also, so most of you have seen this, right? So in taking a longer, more historical view of these ideas in relation to contemporary debates and policy, we're a little more than 3 generations removed from state-based fascisms in Germany, Italy, Portugal, Spain, and France, as well as a handful of polities with democratic features such as the United States, Zimbabwe, South Africa, and much of the colonized world, and what we would now refer to as the Global South. To put a finer point on this, the U.S. cluster of nation-states is less than 4 generations removed from Jim Crow, the Third Reich, and decolonization. Forms of governmentality which made minoritization of marginalized populations and homogenization of dominant populations an objective of state policy. Right? Let's give you another example here. This is from Angela Merkel. Right? Right? I'm thinking about this in juxtaposition to what I've just said, that basically the multiculturalism project in Europe has failed. Now, in many ways, multicultural policies, state policies, and educational policies began earlier in Europe than they did in the United States in the following sense. Europe had its colonial or post-colonial moment much later than the United States did, or much later than most other countries in the New World. Most Spanish colonies had become independent by the second decade of the 19th century. So very distinct post-colonial moments. And then with the rush of immigrants from colonial satellites into the metropolitan centers of Europe, brought about a different set of debates and discussions. Right? So, I would like to suggest that the overwhelming majority of contemporary cases where immigration is viewed as a problem are really not problems of immigration. Instead, they're problems of perception and ultimately a nation-state's ethno-national and racialized history. Thus, the question is not whether the United States, the EU, South Africa, Brazil, China, Japan, or Myanmar, for that matter, are in fact nations of immigrants. Most nation states, in some form or another, are. The more pertinent question is, what are the terms under which various immigrant groups and migratory streams enter into nation states? And what have been the conditions of their acceptance, or alternatively, what are the conditions of their rejection? The lesson I'd like to emphasize here for our contemporary moment is that population homogeneity, like the category of foreigner and citizen, is a political artifact, not something we find readily made in the world, not something that ever existed in and of itself. And in contemporary moment, so many of the origin tales told by various ultranationalist and xenophobic movements rely on stories and genealogies that are themselves mythical, right? Hence the continuities with the classical Athenian case. So now let me briefly walk you through a couple of examples of myths of homogeneity that can be unpacked to reveal the motley assortment of people who have come to constitute the national populations of France, Germany, Italy, as well as the United States. In the case of France, Algerians and Moroccans, but also Cathars, Basques, and Catalans, made up part of the French national population after years of oppression and state centralization, right? So there's a great old classic book by Eugene Weber called Peasants into Frenchmen. And Patrick Vey has written a really good book on nationality, which deals with this as well. Germany was not a single nation state until 1871, with Prussia, Saxony, Brandenburg, Alsace, and other regions often in conflict with each other. Right? For Britain, I just want to summon the words of the late Robin Cook, former mayor of the City of London and a Labour Party stalwart. Right? And he writes that the British are not a race, but a gathering of countless different races and communities, the vast majority of which were not indigenous to these islands. The idea that Britain was a pure Anglo-Saxon society before the arrival of communities from the Caribbean, Asia, and Africa is fantasy. So there he's basically marking that as the post-colonial moment, right? The arrival of colonial subjects, or formerly colonial subjects, to the British metropole. But if this view of British identity is false to our past, it is false to our future too. London was first established as the capital of Celtic Britain by Romans from Italy. They were in turn driven out by Saxons and Angles from Germany. The great cathedrals of this land were built mostly by Norman bishops, but the religion practiced in them was secured by the succession of a Dutch prince. Right? It's a pretty motley assortment of civilizations and peoples. Right? Thus, there was never an era of undifferentiated, non-discriminatory immigration policies within the nation-state system, except in those cases where a state or government has collapsed or was too preoccupied to attend to its borders and population flows. Jews, Turks, Irish, Poles, the Roma, Italians, Mexicans, Japanese, Chinese, Lebanese, a whole host of people have each taken their turn as outsiders in some foreign country, some repeatedly, others infrequently, and others for multiple generations. The countries I briefly alluded to above, as well as many others, face the same problem in invoking some glorified, unified racial and ethno-national past. That past was filled with other peoples, people who had to be assimilated or incorporated into the nation state. And when that proved ethically, politically, culturally, and economically unfeasible, those populations were removed, pacified, or exterminated. Right? And that example we have here in the United States, but also New Zealand, Canada, Australia, and a number of other places. This quest for homogeneity is necessarily a rejection of the individual and a very impoverished understanding of what people often refer to as an identity. The purest pursuit by xenophobes and nationalists of various sorts of homogeneity is the underlying rationale for many, though not all, stringent immigration policies, based upon the belief, uttered by Woodrow Wilson and others, that racial, religious, ethno-national homogeneity will somehow beget unanimity and ultimately the obsolescence of the need for politics. So rather than celebrate or bemoan what is now often referred to as diversity and multiculturalism, public discourse will be far truer to national histories if liberal and right pundits understood a simple fact. The nation state has always been a container imagined, created, and maintained by human beings through social interactions, economies, norms, and political institutions. A container populated by an evolving assortment of nationalities, languages, migrants, and religions. Thus, diversity is a fact, not something to celebrate or decry on its own. The outgrowth or consequence of urbanization, industrialization, and migration. This leads to the question, who is considered acceptable in our society and who is not? By what criteria is it determined who can and who cannot become members of the polity? This is where we get to the matter of race, or more specifically, racial hierarchy instituted in politics. I want to get now to the second part of my talk, basically relationship between the practice of democracy, racial hierarchy, and inequality. Most examples referred to in this section come from the Americas in the 18th and 19th centuries, and I have a big, complicated chart that's in the book, but I will save you the eyesore, and I'll be happy to talk to you about it in the Q&A. Right? As I mentioned before, by the second decade of the 19th century, the majority of former colonies of Spain and Portugal had declared their independence from imperial forebears. Most of the nation states of the Americas, I'm thinking the Americas hemispherically, invoked the revolutions and Republican movements of Europe and the United States as examples for a world of increased democratization. Yet the fledgling democracies of the Americas, much like their counterparts in Europe, shared at least two social and political attributes in common with their common predecessor in the Athenian polis. The coupling of a democratic polity with poorly remunerated labor and citizen regimes that in effect naturalized political membership. Common to the ancient world of city-states and democratic policies of these nation-states was the political and economic objectives of their respective elites. Maximize profit while minimizing, wherever possible, increased civic participation amongst those populations deemed unsuitable for civic participation. Right? Thus, a common question to all of the New World revolutions, right, along with several in the Old World, is the following. Would a liberal democratic revolution create slaves out of masters and transform masters into slaves? In so doing, would the formerly wealthy become the new poor? And would the former slaves, armed with political sovereignty, shirk their responsibility to labor for their former masters? In the Americas, not just the United States, advocates of republicanism inspired by the Bolivarian Revolution and the Haitian revolutions were preoccupied with the unanticipated dangers of popular democratization. Right? In some sense, the key question here is, should all the members of society have access to the polity? Could they either become citizens or have trajectories to become actual citizens? Right? The radical idea that everyone who is a member of a society could in theory become a member of the polity. How could black and brown subjects remain associated with slavery, menial, or at best artisanal labor, become the social equivalent of citizens who are invariably white and male? The leveling of distinction harbored the potential that the very privileges that were referred to in Latin America as the Criollo elite, or the Creole elite, those were the first generation people of European descent born in the New World, sought to enact in wars for national independence be wiped away by the popular classes who they were forced to enlist or conscript as foot soldiers for national liberation. If everyone was equal, who would rule? Who would labor? Though varying in form and combination with other criteria, color and presumed racial distinction became a means to separate the citizen from the non and partial citizen, to once affirm political, phenotypic, and spatial segregation in New World societies. And I come to this conclusion because the majority of nation states in the New World, from Canada to Chile, abolished slavery only after obtaining formal independence, even in instances where they relied on slaves, free people, and their descendants to participate in revolutionary nationalist movements. In other words, these people were participating in movements for national independence without, in fact, achieving their own independence, their own sovereignty over their own bodies. Right? Once independent, these nation states devised federal laws to limit, while not prohibiting completely, formerly enslaved populations and their descendants from participating in civil and political society as citizens with suffrage and property rights, two significant attributes in the political cultures of liberal nation states after the 18th century. I mean, one way to think about it, we can encapsulate that. You think about the entire period of civil rights struggle, and part of that struggle was to get people who were marginalized members of society to become actual members of a democratic polity. Right? Slave emancipation in the Americas, along with the granting of suffrage, combined elements of what philosophers call negative and positive liberty. With suffrage, former slaves became empowered, if only in theory, to determine the terms of both their labor and their politics. In this sense, their newfound freedom would seem to close the gap between themselves and their former owners. Could the same polis that enacted egalitarian laws to create citizens and encourage egalitarian relations between elites also enact laws or policies designed to maintain and perpetuate distinctions between citizen and non-citizen? This is in many ways a central paradox. Right? Now, I'll forego these charts. Indices of difference, the conduit between democracy and inequality. How should we understand the examples I briefly outlined here? As refutations of the very principle of democracy, or a glimpse of the conditions of possibility for imagining and practicing democracy anew? Charles Merriam, an important political scientist on the cusp of the 19th and 20th century at the University of Chicago, suggested that racial hierarchy became a means to extend, maintain, and broaden a belief and practice of aristocracy in the era of modern politics, through the idea of a racial nobility and racial paupers. Merriam identifies the need for credentials of the aristory across the ages, from Aristotle, the National Socialist Party of Germany, and the U.S. South. See the quote, Aristotle lamented that there's no sure distinguishing mark to serve as an infallible index of the slave nature. Although he thought that in general, this might be observed in the cringing manner of the slave, of the inferior. Slaveholders of the South found the missing link, they said, in the color of the Negro. In more modern times, the Germans have found the mark of superiority in the alleged characteristics of the Aryan. And think about the difficulties that the Third Reich had in maintaining a consistent definition of what constituted an Aryan. Right? Again, this sort of extreme quest for a notion of homogeneity as history. Merriam's indices of difference introduces a conceptual means to begin theorizing and identifying empirical evidence of how the idea of race, among other ideas, became part of the language and keywords of politics, providing a means to both categorize and hierarchize populations through institutional and bureaucratic means, and ultimately in dynamics of power. The indices of differences became politically salient, not through biological or ecclesiastic rationalizations for inequality, but by the political institutions and social dynamics structured by them, with a little bit of help by the modern state. Whether it's Aristotle's interpretation of cringing gesture, blackness in the United States, or so-called Aryan features in Germany, the mark of inferiority constituted in social and material relations, inscribed in the symbology of material and political life, was an instrument used to distinguish those who would labor for others, those who could labor for themselves, or those who did not have to labor for at all. Certainly, racial and ethno-national hierarchy are not the only ways in which we can track the evolution and emergence of institutional development and variation. But racial and ethno-national hierarchy in modern politics provides many opportunities to examine the emergence and development of institutionalized racism, what I referred to earlier as racial regimes. Right? The existence of these regimes in democratic polities enables scholars to consider broader, more abstract questions about the entanglements of citizen, society, and polity. Under what conditions does democracy require barriers to membership? Could it be that even under the most practical conditions for the elaboration of democratic ideals, a subordinated laboring majority population with limited or non-existent political rights was necessary for the functioning of democracy for the few? Now to conclude, my reason for spending so much time outlining the invention of homogeneity and the use of the race concept as a politically salient instrument is to highlight the role of politics in the construction and maintenance of inequality. Jeffrey Winters, in his book Oligarchy, frames the problem thus, quote, what does it mean to have democracy among a segment of society juxtaposed to the massive exclusion of many, slaves, women, non-property citizens? Winters' broadly framed question reminds us the relationship between politics and economies, and the role of political institutions, formal and informal, in structuring the terms and conditions of political exclusion, economic marginalization, and in many instances, state-sanctioned violence. As we move further away from the institution of racial slavery that spanned the 16th and 19th centuries, we can rely less on the institution of slavery and industrial capitalism as comprehensive explanations for contemporary denials of political equality and access in Western policies. Evidence of racial and ethno-national regimes in the contemporary world provide clues on how to grasp ongoing patterns and dynamics of exclusion, in structuring and selection of specific populations for the most dangerous, unhealthy, and poorly remunerated labor on the planet. According to economists such as Thomas Piketty, and sociologists such as Kevin Bales, and political science, who I've already mentioned, Jeffrey Winters, there's greater inequality in the contemporary world than at any other moment in human history, and that's a staggering conclusion. That means greater inequality than in ancient Egypt, Rome, and Athens, or during the long 19th century, which concluded with the collapse of several major Western empires and the so-called scramble for Africa by the West's major powers. Shifts in scale and forms of profit generation generated by capitalists, the increased socialization of the risks involved when capitalist ventures fail, think about 2008, coupled with the neoliberal privatization of health and welfare provisions once provided by states, tells part of the story of how such vast inequalities have been generated across the world. Across the very same period of time, however, certainly from the 18th century onward, we've also witnessed the proliferation of democratic movements in Asia, Africa, Latin America, as well as Europe and North America. How can increasing inequality coexist with democracy and freedom? To be sure, part of the issue here is how one defines democracy and freedom, but that's not my concern or aspiration here. What I've tried to suggest and underscore is how the quest for homogeneity and democracy have been intertwined in the same political project, the project of nation and state, and how racial and ethno-national hierarchy has operated in the nation-state system as a filter for citizenship, and thus access to economic as well as political privilege. Nation-state populations, and by extension their governments, are distinguished by the idea that their political recognition and national identity is somehow rooted in the territory where they were born and granted citizenship. Yet the very idea of rootedness in a nation-state, proclaimed by some nationalist or another, is but a thinly veiled attempt to naturalize the idea and practice of citizenship in a spatial and administrative container, which is an entirely human and thus political manufacture. And within that container, populations who are deemed ineligible for citizenship or considered less valuable members of the polity often experience either incomplete partial citizenship status, or none at all. Thus has been the reality not only for authoritarian societies, but for democratic societies as well. Disagreements within Europe and the United States regarding who is and who can be a European or a citizen of the United States can be boiled down to the following question. By what criteria should we allow some people in and not others? Who shall we let settle? In answering these questions, policymakers and the average citizen may do well to consider that the possibility that democracy itself, as historically and politically practiced, may be part of the problem and not necessarily the solution to intolerance and inequality in the contemporary world. And it's important to remember that the idea as well as the political practice of democracy predates both capitalism and liberalism. Both democracy and the nation-state system are in need of significant repair. Their shortcomings in the contemporary world cannot be overcome, as President Trump, Reverend Wood, or other ethno-nationalists around the contemporary world would have us believe, by invoking statistics to prove that racial or ethno-national superiority of one group over others. How successful right-wing populist movements and ultimately governments are in not only utilizing myths of homogeneity and racial inequality to order and manage their social and political communities, but also provides a way to trace the contours and limits of democracy in the contemporary world. Thank you. Comments?
Some of the great empires, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the Mughal Empire, the Russian, were they more successful in integrating different peoples?
No, it's a fantastic question. So the Habsburg Empire, as a scholar, is one of my favorites. So one of the things that many of the big imperial projects manage, not without high degrees of coercion, but that because in many cases they managed and held under their sort of domain populations who live far beyond the metropolitan center or the site of government, right? In many cases, they couldn't possibly make homogeneity or language criteria, right, the sole basis of membership in the political community. But remember, we're talking about empire, so in many cases, we're talking not necessarily about citizens, but about subjects. But the Austro-Habsburg Empire is very interesting precisely because of this. Many of those movements, what came to be known as the non-historical populations, this was Engels' term, right, were generated by nationalist middle classes and elites who wanted basically their language, whether it was Magyar or Pole, to be the language of national government. And the only way to have that was if they had a government of their own, right? And at the end, Franz Joseph tried to maintain the empire by providing prospects for national sovereignty for these what would be then newly independent nation states. And it was basically an effort to save the empire, right? But it didn't work.
Hi, my name is Jennifer, and I'm an undergraduate student in the college.
Whoa.
Oh my gosh, sorry.
About to say something powerful.
But my question was, in a democratic society, how can you integrate and represent diverse groups whose values might be fundamentally in conflict with each other? So for example, in the Indian subcontinent, the Kashmir region is seeing a lot of conflict for the past 60 years because there's people who just fundamentally are different, and it's not just in that region, but also all over the Indian subcontinent. So what do you think is the best method to kind of have those people coexist?
Mm-hmm. I guess the question is what do you mean by difference, and what makes certain differences politically salient and not others, right? So can you give me, when you say these populations are fundamentally different, can you give me an example? So you're talking about the... Well, that led to the split between India and Pakistan, for example. Yeah. But again, the presumption is in some sense that the nation state would be the place to resolve these kinds of problems. So the Pakistanis broke from India, right, because of what's perceived fundamental religious differences, even though one could point to many parts of India where a number of religious practices were undertaken, and often in many cases people coexisted, right, or lived in what would be known as plural populations. But nation statehood became a key instrument for recognition in the contemporary world, right? So it became an object of desire for Pakistani, but also other nationalists. But you could, to add to these examples, you could talk about the Uyghurs in China, you can talk about the Rohingya in Myanmar, right? Populations that are seen as being so fundamentally different that they can't be incorporated, right, into a particular society. But we have to beg and ask the question, then what makes certain populations, by perception, more easily made into national subjects than others, right? And that gets back to the question I started out with.
I don't know quite how to frame it, but some of these countries that is there resistance in some of these countries for the resources that, like a post-colonial taking of the resources? I wouldn't really call it immigration,
right,
but it's just sort of settling, not really asking or being
right,
invited or welcomed in, but settling, taking various resources and then
sure,
just sort of moving on with it. Is there some sort of organized resistance to that, and why is that never raised as a counter to your being against this country, the powers that be being against immigration?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I think there are two different points in there. One, what does distinguish the United States when we're talking about immigration and migration is that I don't know if there's any other country on the planet, perhaps, you know, the former Soviet Union, that's ever dealt with the consistent scale of immigration and migration from other parts of the world into a so-called host country. So there are countries, say for example, you know, Austria and the problem with Syrians a couple of years ago, right? One could at least, you know, I think charitably say that, you know, influx of several 100,000 people at a particular time, or 1 million people at a particular time, would pose, you know, certain kinds of bureaucratic problems, distributions of goods, services, and resources. But in the colonial experience, I don't give much credence to this explanation. I'll give you a couple of examples. So France and its relationship to Algeria, right? France, the French government had subsidized immigration policies, used Algerian labor, both for the defense of France during World War II, but also to rebuild France, particularly in the area of agriculture. One of the ironies of a place like Britain is a if you get a chance, the Manchester Guardian, which I think is probably the best newspaper in the English language, has done a series of stories about the Windrush generation of Caribbean immigrants that went to Britain. And they went to Britain at the request of the British government because Britain was devastated during World War II. So they needed, you know, they had severe labor shortages. And the basic understanding was that these people, as British colonial subjects, they didn't necessarily need passports. They didn't necessarily need other forms of identification. Under Theresa May's government and the sort of get tough with immigration policies and supposedly, you know, in coordination with the war on terror, the Windrush generation was targeted by the May government and often deported from the UK, been told that they had to provide some evidence that they were in fact, had been residents in the United Kingdom, while at the same time destroying the very evidence that was in the archives, proving that these people had landed on the Windrush or came sometime between the 1950s and the 1980s, right? And, you know, just listened to this on NPR this morning that on the Mexican-U.S. border, U.S. citizens who are, crossing in from Mexico to the United States, or trying to cross it, are often not getting their passports renewed because the claim is they can't prove, in fact, that they are citizens. Now, in most places, a passport is an indication of citizenship, right? So basically, it helps render these people illegible, right? That they're not legible for citizenship. So in an odd way, not that severe, but you sort of think about these projects and in their extreme. And so you think about, the modern Holocaust, 1933, 1945, right? This was the first country in the history of the nation-state system to basically take away citizenship from people who are already citizens, right? This is what happened in the process of Aryanization, right? And when governments make these kinds of moves, right, they're undergirded by premises that certain populations should not be part of the national, either national society or be part of the political community. So the part of these arguments that I don't buy is that in many cases, these so-called immigrants or migrants have often contributed to the national economies of these societies, often through subsidized immigration policies generated by the host governments. Right? So this is in many ways the complexity of this situation.
Sorry.
This may be the most naive question of the afternoon, but it seems to me that if we are all generally looking for liberty, the pursuit of happiness, just these universal principles, why would it be so difficult to build democracy around that? Why can't groups, because we're all different, and different is always relative, so I suppose it's the people at the very top saying you're different from me, right? And so therefore you're less acceptable. But that's just so illogical to me. I don't understand why communities can't be developed around their differences and then there be a republic with more general principles that just sort of provide infrastructure and do more general things and it still be considered a nation. What is this? What are these preferential characteristics that make you more acceptable for a democracy or to be part of a nation?
Well, the last part is part of what the talk was about. So the sense of ways in which gender distinctions, ethno-national distinctions, religious distinctions, so-called racial distinctions are often served as qualifiers of membership in a political community. What I was getting at with several of the questions I generated in the talk, let's think about the United States in this regard. I think the first California Constitution was bilingual. It's a recognition that you had a sizable Spanish-speaking population. In states like Minnesota, I think it's Scandinavian immigrants who either participated in government or held formal local governmental positions, actually used Scandinavian as a language of state, right? So the idea somehow that there was somehow this operative English-only paradigm that existed in every part of the country from time immemorial, just historically, is just false, right? And what I'm saying is that you can look at most nation states on the planet and they've had a variety of different populations in its midst. The question I'm asking is, why is it that some differences matter and not others? Why do some differences become politically salient and others draw no comment at all? That's it?
That's it.
All right. All right. I got a reason. Thank you very much.